Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts and you're watching The Naked Empire. This evening we have Ray McGovern, who is a former senior CIA analyst whose duties include preparing the President's Daily Brief and chairing national intelligence estimates. He is a member of the group Veterans for Peace. Ray McGovern leads the Speaking Truth to Power section of Tell the Word, a publishing arm of the Ecumenical Church of the Saviour in Inner City, Washington, a former co-director of the Servant Leadership School from 1998 to 2004. He has been teaching there for more than 20 years. His current course is on the morality of whistleblowing. Ray came to Washington from his native Bronx in the early 60s as an Army infantry intelligence officer, and then served as a CIA analyst for 27 years from the administration of John F. Kennedy to that of George H.W. Bush. Ray's duties included chairing national intelligence estimates and preparing the President's Daily Brief, which he briefed one-on-one to President Ronald Reagan's 5 most senior national security advisors from 1981 to 1985. In January 2003, Ray co-created Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity to expose how intelligence was being falsified to, quote, justify, end quote, the war in Iraq. So without further ado, I'll bring on Ray. Hi, Ray. How are you?
Hello. I'm fine.
So I'm in Tasmania and Ray is in Washington, D.C., so that's quite a distance, and hopefully we won't have any tech problems. So Ray, I thought we talked about it and we thought we might start off with the, there's been a lot of mainstream media, I guess you can call it propaganda really, about Russia in the last year or so in relation to the so-called hacking of the DNC, and I wonder if you could just talk about your view of that. Was it a hack or was it a leak? And the NSA, of course, we both talked about that too, and how it would have been so easy, right, like that, to sort of for the NSA to work that out. But anyway, I'll leave that to you to talk about.
Well, Tricia, you're quite right, and this is one of the most important aspects of this. The NSA does have an incredible capability, and we are blessed in our little movement of veteran intelligence officers with alumni, so to speak, from the National Security Agency, with expertise that just won't quit. 2 former technical directors, a former senior analyst. They all worked on these systems and know them inside out in their sleep. Now, they couldn't really talk very much about them until Ed Snowden brought out the material, brought out these slides showing exactly how it works. So when Bill Binney, who was one of these technical directors, said to me, Ray, look, it's going to be hard to believe, but they can intercept all the emails and all the telephone calls. They don't read them all, they don't listen to them all, but they got them, okay? And they can retrieve them. And I'd say, yeah, right. And he said, no, they can. And we know it because now we know exactly how they do it, thanks to our friend Ed Snowden. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if a year ago, when all this talk started about the Russians hacking into the Democratic National Committee computers, okay, when all that started, Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe and Ed Loomis, the 3 major NSA figures we have with us, alumni, of course, they said, well, okay, if that were to happen, we would know about it. The NSA would know about it. I said, really? I said, yeah, Ray, the way it works is this. There are trace routes. There are trace points. Here's a slide that Ed Snowden brought out. And we've mapped all the little trace points where they can trace everything. And the way it works, Ray, again, you're not very technical, but this is the way it works. These messages are broken down into little packets, okay? Little packets. And each one has a little label on them so that when it goes through the pipeline or through the network, at the other end, these packets know how to get back together and they're in another email box. And so all this stuff is very easily controlled and very easily monitored. So if there was a hack, they would know about it. Now, Julian Assange, I mean, we have an expression in NSA. We call the coverage that is administered to Julian Assange cast iron. Okay, that means that nothing gets in there. Nothing gets in that little embassy of Ecuador in London that escapes our attention. So, and for all his lieutenants as well. So, cast iron coverage. So, if there was a hack, a Russian hack or any kind of hack from the Democratic National Committee computers, NSA would have the goods. Now, we published on that. And of course, you know, I mean, it's conclusive if you understand the system. But for most people, their eyes sort of glaze over and they say, well, gosh, didn't Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, didn't he went to Princeton, one of those Ivy League universities, and he learned all kinds of learned things. And one of the things he said was that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we know there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Just because we don't have any evidence of it doesn't mean they're not there. Okay. Now that's a crazy way to go at it. Of course, we know what the real story was, but it's still sort of negative evidence, right? If it happened, we would know about it. Now, what happens? All of a sudden, 2 months ago, a couple of very, very independent, very, very truth-minded individuals that really are in the same wavelength as us, no agenda, just trying to find out what really happened. One fellow goes by the name of Adam Carter. He's in London. Another fellow calls himself Forensicator. Now, why are these pseudonyms? Well, what they're saying is really, really explosive. And they realize the long arm of MI5 or the CIA, FBI could easily snap them up. So they try to protect themselves in a rudimentary way. So what happened? Well, they looked into the celebrated leak that took place, hack leak. I'll explain. On the 5th of July, 2016, okay? This was the one that everyone said showed that the Russians hacked into the Democratic National Committee. Now, what did they find? Well, they looked at what's called the metadata, the information that goes along with these messages. They found out, whoa, that download from the network took place at a speed, megabytes per second. I won't go into the numbers because, frankly, I forget them. But megabytes per second, that's far in excess of what you can do over the internet. What's the result of that? Well, that means it was a thumb drive that you put into a computer and download it, because it was exactly the same speed that you download onto a thumb drive. Whoa, what does that mean? That means it couldn't have been a hack by Russia or anybody else over the network, over the internet, because the internet capability was not high enough for that speed. So we have the principles of physics here, and we have the known capabilities of the internet. And so couldn't have been a hack. So what else did we notice from that information? We found out that this operation at the Democratic National Committee computers or servers took place in the Eastern Daylight Time Zone. Not Vladivostok or Khabarovsk, but it could be Bangor, Maine, or it could be Miami, or places in between, maybe Washington or New York, Brooklyn. So that was another telltale, really, really interesting thing we found out. Then we found out that the fellow that took credit for all this and said he was working for Julian Assange, right? Guccifer 2.0, turns out that he had taken some information 3 weeks before and adulterated it by a simple cut and paste job. What he did was he got some Russian, well-known Russian, what do they call them, templates, okay? And he took the information and he superimposed them over the templates to show it was the Russians, okay? And just in case you missed that, there was a little Cyrillic Russian, at the bottom of these things. One of them was Felix Emundovich. Now get this. Who's he? Everyone knows in Russia, at least. Felix Emundovich is Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Soviet secret police way back under Stalin, or Lenin, really, okay? So it was like they didn't want us to miss that this was the Russians hacking. But so all these things we put together, the time and the date, particularly the speed. And the speed is what really is incontrovertible. Everyone knows what the internet was capable of back last July. And they know that the speed with which this was put onto an external storage device, like a thumb drive, was far in excess of what the internet could have done. Now, what happened? Well, they couldn't get their findings published. The findings were scrutinized by other scientists and engineers and found to be valid. And so we were tipped off to this, and I asked our NSA, National Security Council, National Security Agency, former employees, what do you think of this? And they looked at it real carefully, and they said, Ray, QED. Now, for people who are a little younger than we, when they complete theorems in geometry these days, perhaps they don't put the QED at the bottom as we were required to do, but QED means quod erat demonstrandum, which means that which was to be demonstrated. Okay? Right. That's what was to be proven. So what Bill Binney is saying, look, I've been saying for a year, it couldn't be a hack. If this is what they say was a hack, now we have QED, that which was to be demonstrated, it couldn't be because it was too fast a download. Now, after we went through that and got coordination with it on a little veteran intelligence professionals for sanity folks, we put out a memorandum, 24th of July, which was pretty, it was pretty explosive actually, because we put the conclusions right up front. Forensic studies now, not the lack of evidence. Forensic studies of Russian hacking into the DNC reveal that the data was leaked, not hacked, by a person. So it was leaked by a person with physical access to the DNC computers, namely in the Eastern time zone, because it had to be an incursion of that kind, and independent cyber investigators have concluded that this was the case. Why? Mostly because of the speed factor. Too fast to have been done on the internet. Now, this leads to the question of why it was that these independent forensic investigators were the only ones to look at this metadata and other information connected with these so-called Russian hacks. Well, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to understand why the FBI did not investigate, why the DNC had this, well, it had a computer firm called CrowdStrike. Very, 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 what's the word? Very loose reputation, Wrong on many things, particularly things about Ukraine, and very pro-Russian. And so they had this CrowdStrike thing, and CrowdStrike looked at it and said, it was the Russians. Malware traced to the Russians. And then out of the ashes comes this Guccifer 2.0 person thing, who knows, and says, yeah, we can confirm that because we did it. And we're working for Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, okay? Now, did the FBI say, wait a second now, Senator McCain is saying that this is an act of war by Russia against us. Maybe we should kind of look, maybe we should look at these computers and server and do our own forensics. Did he say that? No, no. He never even, you know, they say that the Democratic National Committee said, no, we don't want you in there. CrowdStrike's good enough for us. But look, the head of the FBI, all he had to do was get a warrant. All he had to do was crash down the door in the basement. There's no excuse for why James Comey didn't look at the forensics there. And I'll have an explanation as to why I think he didn't do that later. But that's a key factor here. So the only forensic comes from these other people. They can't get a decent hearing, as we usually can't. But luckily, somebody, a writer for The Nation magazine. Now, The Nation magazine is a fairly progressive magazine. It's been around longer than any other magazines in our country. And he took a real shine to what we found out. His name was Patrick Lawrence. And he said, hey, could I interview all your friends? And, you know, I think we ought to, I mean, hello, this is so countercultural. This is so counterintuitive and against the narrative that's been promoted, where 80% of the American people believe that, they believe this now, they get this, 80% of the American people believe that we have Vladimir Putin to thank for that clown we have in the White House. My God, what could be worse than that, you know? So let's see if we can look into this. So Patrick Lawrence interviewed us all. Tiresome, man, an investigator that won't stop asking questions, like he'd asked it 3 different ways, but he got together a really good article for The Nation magazine and published that 2 weeks after our own article, which is on veteran intelligence professional sanity. It's on my website as well. My website is raymcgovern.com, in case I forget to say that. What happened then? Whoa! Now, bear in mind, The Nation magazine is very progressive. That used to mean, and still means to some people, democratic, very close to Hillary Rodham Clinton, and very much wed to this idea that the Russians did it, the Russians did it, the Russians did it. And so there was a rebellion in the editorial staff. And they went to the Washington Post and leaked all kinds of objections to this. And what's this Patrick Lawrence trying to do? And trying to get him fired, you know, all this business. So the result of all this is that we got more exposure than we normally get. We're also getting, as we used to say in the infantry, a lot of incoming, okay? Right. We're getting incoming like we've never had before, because this destroys the widely accepted myth that Vladimir Putin so much wanted Trump to win and so much wanted Hillary to lose that he somehow hacked into the DNC and gave these very damaging emails to WikiLeaks. Now, just before I forget to mention this, our former president, Obama, before he left office, held a press conference 2 days before he left office, the 18th of January. And what he said was really strange. They were asking him about the so-called Russian hacking. And of course, he had bought into the whole thing. And so he said, you know, be aware that the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to how Russian hacking got to WikiLeaks are inconclusive. Ooh, wait a second. You have inconclusive conclusions. And what you're telling us, Mr. President, is that no one knows, your intelligence people don't know how this so-called Russian hack got to WikiLeaks? Whoa! Guess what? No one asked him any questions about that. It was really ridiculous, okay? So he goes out sort of protecting himself like lawyers do, saying, well, I told you that the conclusions or inconclusive didn't make a dent in the whole thing. So I can continue here unless your patience is being worn or you want to ask.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
All right.
I was actually wanting to ask you, how is it possible that, oh, I was getting a bit of feedback here. How is it possible that people don't sort of think, you know, when whoever did the leak left those very obvious telltale things that they were obviously trying to point to, you know, Russia. I mean, it's just so sort of, I don't know, childish in a way. Do you know what I mean? Just sort of like, it's like people leaving passports at you know, and I just sort of think, why would somebody do that if they really want people, excuse me, to believe that it's, you know, that it was Russia? Why would they leave such obvious things that make it look like they really want you to believe that? Do you know what I mean? Who would do that? Is that, it wouldn't be like somebody who's a spy, would it? Or is it somebody who's a bit, you know, a bit amateurish and just kind of thought, oh, I better, you know, leave these, you know, things implicating Russia kind of thing?
My answer to that would be, it would have to be someone who could depend on a mainstream media that would swallow this hook, line, and sinker, because this media has the same objective, that is to explain why Hillary lost, to explain why Trump is no good, and most important, to put a spike in any effort that Trump had to cultivate a more decent relationship with Russia. So it was an all-purpose thing. And unfortunately, in our country, perhaps it's somewhat similar in yours, most people don't really look beneath the headlines. Most people put their feet up at night, feed the children, and then kind of relax and watch Fox News or something like that. And they think they're getting the news, but they're not. And so just as before Iraq, and this is important, I started getting really involved in these kinds of things when I saw that my former colleagues were violating our ethos of speaking truth to power. And when George Bush and Dick evidence, and they fabricated the evidence. Now, most people think that the evidence was, as Cheney and Bush say, it was unfortunately mistaken. Well, it pains me greatly to say this because I know these guys, right? It wasn't mistaken. It was fraud, out and out fraud. They knew what they were doing, okay? So that's really important. Now, what's my point? My point is that because of the media drumbeat, 69% of the American people believed that Saddam Hussein, the head of Iraq, had something to do with 9/11. Not only that he had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't, but also that he had this sinister nexus with Al Qaeda. That's what Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, called it, a sinister nexus. Okay, so they have these ties, operational ties with Al Qaeda, and most Americans bought that. So right before,
do they still buy it, Ray? Do you think? Has it clicked now because it's been so much evidence out that was just a big fraud, basically?
Well, you know, I hate to say this, but there's not a lot of interest in this. I mean, this, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, the attention span is not very great. And again, the media is not going to say, whoops, we either participated in a fraud or we were so naive as to drive home this fraud. So again, it's the media. And, you know, I'll just say this one time because I try to remember to say this. When you're as old as me with this color hair, right, and you've been in Washington 55 years, you've seen a lot of change, right? But there's one change. the election to Donald Trump? Well, I've seen one poll, I think it was an AP poll, 70%. 70% of the American people are convinced that the Russians hacked into our election, and that had they not hacked into our election, we wouldn't end up with this clown in the White House. That's big. It's not only big because it's a false explanation of why Hillary lost. I mean, there were lots of reasons why Hillary lost, but can the Democrats acknowledge that she was just a really terrible candidate that nobody trusted? No. Couldn't be that. It had to be the Russians, okay? Now, they tried that before the election. It didn't work. Right after the election, they tried it in spades, and it's worked. Now it's worked. And now Trump, I hold no brief for Trump, as you probably gather from my remarks. But, even a broken clock is right, I think, twice a day, right? And Trump was dead right with respect to creating a more decent relationship with Russia. There's nothing to prevent that. They are no threat to us. The only threat they are is if there's a détente or if there's a rapprochement with Russia, the arms dealers, the arms manufacturers in this country will not have such lucrative gains. So what I'm saying here is that this was an all-purpose charade or a trick, really, to blame it on the Russians, first to make sure that Hillary was not affected by it, then to explain why Hillary lost, and now, most sinister, to prevent an improvement of relations with Russia. If you look back, it's really kind of very revealing because, well, let's go back and talk about a different subject, related but different. So we're putting a dividing line here.
Okay.
Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did get those emails from the Democratic National Committee. As I said before, we kind of knew all along it wasn't through a hack. How'd they get them? Well, it is almost certain, according to the experts, and this is just not just McGovern, that it came the same way from a download onto an external storage device, a thumb drive, for example, and given to Julian Assange by somebody or one of his lieutenants physically. So it didn't go over the network. So it didn't get intercepted by NSA. Ipso facto, it would have been. So now, how do we know that? Well, we know that from the negative evidence, but we also know that Julian Assange had all that information before June 12th of last year, when he announced, and I quote, "We have emails related to Hillary Clinton, and we're about to publish them." Now, this is important. Bear in mind, this is the 12th of June, 2016. Now, what happens next? Whoops. On the 14th of June, this cyber outfit that works for Hillary Clinton's Democratic National Committee says, we've just detected malware in the DNC computers, and there are telltale signs it's the Russians. So you have the 12th, Julian Assange saying, we got these emails pertaining to Hillary Clinton. 2 days later, CrowdStrike says, malware in the DNC computers. And then the next day, the 15th, all of a sudden, out of the ether appears Lucifer 2.0. What does he say? He says, CrowdStrike is exactly right. We can verify that because you know what? We did it. And we're working for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Whoa. Now, why do I take you through that? Well, if I were a Democratic National Committee member or Hillary Clinton, I would say, oh my God, Julian Assange has our emails. Oh, maybe if he's got any of them, he may have all of them, and it'll show that we stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Oh, this is terrible. What are we gonna do? And I could see him sitting around the table there on the 15th or the 14th or the 12th of June last year, saying, "I don't know what we can do about this." And somebody says, "Well, I know what we'll do. We'll blame it on the Russians." Mm-hmm. Somebody else says, "Well, but it's not the Russians. It's WikiLeaks." That's all right. We'll have a twofer here. We'll get them both. We'll say that there was a hack here, the Russians. It was given to WikiLeaks, and so the kind of Hillary and the others said, "Well, is that the best you can do?" Well, it's not so shabby, because we can get the media to climb onto this, and if and when Julian Assange releases these things, mind you, he just announced he had them on the 12th of June. He eventually released them on the 22nd of July. Okay, well, if he does release them, then we say it was the Russians, it was the Russians, it was the Russians, and then maybe nobody will look at what's in the emails. Mm-hmm. Worked like a charm. Worked like a charm. And didn't it? Well, they needed the complete cooperation of the media, and the media gave it that. And there's all kinds of interesting things when you're a CIA analyst. You have to do all kinds of things, like read memoirs and make sure you cover the press completely, and so we could see what was going on here, and we could notice that there's something very strange here. And that when Hillary Clinton's PR person, her name is Jennifer Palmieri, she wrote a big article, front page article for the Washington Post, and she said, "Wow, we had to go around to all the cable and other outlets at the convention. As a matter of fact, I took a golf cart. And our mission was to get them to run the story that the Russians hacked into our things, and they want Clinton to lose, they want Trump to win." And she says, it's a real hard sell. The outlets, the cable people, they weren't interested in that, the Russians, and we had some problems ourselves figuring out how that went. But then, and this is the important thing, she said, then we get back to Brooklyn, which was Hillary Clinton's headquarters. And then some intelligence people and some journalists who have good ties with intelligence started giving us the real information about the hacking. And better still, the Obama administration would confirm these stories that we got from the intelligence people. Then we were in business. Then we could put out a story, and we'd have some substance behind it, because the Washington Post and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they had enough to go on. So then it was a case of trying to tar Trump with cooperating with Putin, and trying to defeat Hillary. Now, that would have worked if Hillary was a decent candidate. But, I have to tell you, not too many people trusted her. And she was very much able to lose the election all by herself without any help from anybody else. And that's what happened. Now, sequel to it, after she lost, then the intelligence agencies and the DNC went into high gear, okay? They actually tried to prevent the body that the college of the body of people who actually do the actual voting in December. They tried to prevent them from voting for the way they're supposed to for Trump. That didn't work, and then they decided, well, at least we can make sure that Trump can never reach out to Russia to have a decent relationship. And as transparent as these efforts were and are, most American people are blissfully unaware of them. And you know, when you're talking about relations with the other nuclear superpower, and there are still basically two, and you're destroying a relationship to make it, I have to tell you, it's just as dicey, just as tense now as at any time during the 55 years I've been focused on this. That matters. Because if I were Vladimir Putin, and I think I know, I can pretend to know out of 55 years how Russian leaders look at things, I would have my strategic forces perhaps not on the highest alert, but on a higher alert than normal, because there's no telling what Trump or these generals that he has. Mad Dog is the name of his defense minister. And he's proud of that. So that's bad.
And
that's
all the DNC. All the, like even Sanders voted for Mad Dog Mattis. You know, I mean,
yeah, you know,
guys, you know, the war crimes in Iraq and stuff. I mean, wow.
Yeah, these are real war crimes. Fallujah, Al-Haditha, even those 18 Marines that killed all those folks and then did terrible things to them were released or exculpated by Mad Dog Mattis. So what I'm saying here is that you could look at it as inside baseball, all this, you know, inside the Beltway maneuvering and all this stuff to discredit Trump. And it's a lot that, but it's consequential in the strategic sense that our relationship with the Russians has deteriorated to the extent where we throw them out of their consulate in San Francisco that goes back like 180 years, and then we kind of invade it and, you know, rummage through. So I don't know who's running things, but people talk about the deep state, and I think that that's a handy moniker for the kinds of folks that would do those kinds of things. For what? Just to prove that we can do them? So that's very dangerous. Yeah,
really. You know, I just wanted to, if I may, Ray, go, you know, how I wanted to talk about somebody that you mentioned, George F. Kennan, and you said he was quite a hero of yours until you sort of read this thing that he said, and I'll just read it out. He was sort of setting a new direction in U.S. foreign policy in the State Department after World War II. And in 1948, George Kennan said, quote, "We control 50% of the world's natural resources. We only represent 1/9 of the people of the world. Therefore, we must do all we can to preserve this lack of proportion. We cannot be diverted by soft concepts like civil rights, human rights, and other soft things if we want to preserve this imbalance. Sooner or later, we will have to resort to very hard tactics," end quote. And he was saying basically it's kind of been that way ever since, really, the sort of U.S. foreign policy. And when I was thinking about when Hillary Clinton, during the Democratic National Congress speech, she said, quote, "America is great because America is good." And when she was saying that, in my mind, it almost reminded me of, you know, the sound, you know, that movie, The Sound of Music, where everybody gets up at one point and starts singing "Tomorrow Belongs to Me," you know, tomorrow belongs. And honestly, I thought, it just really did, you know, it was sort of like, it was scary when she said that. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, that's a sort of this idea of American exceptionalism in quotes. And I just wondered if what, you know, you think about this idea of American exceptionalism.
Well, you know, it's hard not to be kind of snide about it. You're quite right in pointing out that after World War II, and I have to say that I was alive for all of World War II, having been born just 1 week before Hitler drove his tanks into Poland, okay? So I grew up in the aftermath of the war, but the war was a pervasive atmosphere during all my youth. And when I went to Europe very, very early on, I could see what the war had wrought. America has no sense of that. we're very fortunate with these two oceans. But
Mm.
that's the reality. If you ask
Mm.
an American about World War II, and you say, well, there were pretty heavy casualties. How many American soldiers died? And they'll say, oh, well, we know that. That's almost 500,000. Again, how many Russians do you think died? And so, oh, maybe even more, maybe a million. And then I say, well, would you believe 25 to 27 million? No, that couldn't be that. You know,
Mm.
it's just a lack of education, lack of appreciation of who really turned the Nazis back. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
and they did lose 27 million. Or
Mm.
Putin says 25 million. Well, I'll take 25. That's an awful lot. So we emerge as the sole indispensable country in the world right after World War II. Okay, now you heard what Kennan says. We're only 1/9 of the world's population. Now I think we're sort of like 1/12 to 1/13 or something. And so our foreign policy, and bear in mind, this was the first paper written by the newly established policy planning group of the State Department, which Kennan headed. So our policy has to be to maintain this lack of proportionality, this disequilibrium, you know. And he's talking about raw materials. He's talking about the riches of the world, the mineral wealth, and all that kind of stuff. So, and then he says, now we can't be diverted by soft concepts like altruism and human rights. There'll come a time when we have to resort to hard power. Well, that's what happened. For a while, there was a rivalry with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union imploded. Okay, so now we're fast forwarding to 1989, 1990, and the immediate years after that, and we become indisputably the sole indispensable country of the world. Now, when I lecture at colleges, I like to spring this on the students. I say, well, now, do you all know what synonyms are? And most of them say, oh, yeah, that's a like word. So how about an antonym? Maybe you get one or two, you know, say, oh, yeah, that's an opposite word. Yeah, I said, okay. So what's the antonym for indispensable? Yeah, I think, well, would it be, I guess it's dispensable. Yeah, that's right. So all the other countries are what? Dispensable, right? We're the sole indispensable. So what do you think about it? How do you think other countries look at that, you know? And is it going to be very true very longer? Well, no, it's not going to be, okay? It's already not true. But it kind of reflects this city on the hill mentality, which is reinforced by the fact that nobody's knocked us off the hill. Nobody's invaded us, you know? And so we are sort of inviolable, indispensable. And, you know, it's really, really interesting because Vladimir Putin, after he bailed President Obama out on Syria, and very briefly, Obama was about to attack Syria, a independent country violating international law, and it all had to do with a chemical incident, which we know was a false flag attack now. But Putin says to Obama, they're up in St. Petersburg for one of these summits, and he says, you know, we can get the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons. And we know what they are. We gave them the designs for it, and we know where they are. So how would that be? They can get you off the hook here. Obama said, you can? He said, yeah. Tune in to TV tomorrow because the Syrian foreign minister is going to announce that he's willing to give up all his chemical weapons, that is, all the chemical weapons in Syria, under UN verification for destruction on a U.S. ship specifically outfitted for such purpose. And Obama said, wow, that would be great. Okay. Now, did that happen? Yeah, it happened. Do Australians know about that? Well, not if they're like Americans. That's sort of a memory hole. That happened. So My point is this. On the 11th of September, 2013, just as Putin had persuaded Obama, look, you don't have to attack Syria. We're going to get rid of the so-called casus belli. At that time, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. Vladimir Putin did, and was published on September 11th. Probably, coincidence. September 11th, 2013. And he said, and this is what he said, I am very happy with the new atmosphere of trust that exists between our two countries and between us two presidents personally. And he went on in that vein. But the last paragraph says, Putin, the only thing I really object to is the notion that there are indispensable countries in the world. There are weak countries, there are strong countries, there are democratic countries, there are people on the way to democracy. But he finishes up by saying, all are the same in God's sight. And I think we need to recognize that. Whoa. So here's Putin giving Americans through the New York Times. I guess they didn't feel they could excise that last paragraph, as they do with my paragraph. But the idea is that, not the idea. I have a very, very good source that says that Putin wrote that last paragraph himself. He had somebody else do but then he wrote that in. Now, that was September 2013. What happened after that? There were the Sochi Olympics, where Putin's vision was fixated on the prevention of terrorist events. There were all kinds of people, the Saudis and the Chechens and so forth, threatening. Okay, he gets through that. He finishes up with a sigh of relief on the 21st of February, 2014. And what happens? The West mounts a coup d'etat on Russia's doorstep in Kiev, in the Ukraine. Now, they were going to get NATO into Ukraine, a direct threat to the Russians. And the Russians had told us about that explicitly. And we have the cables, thanks to WikiLeaks, we have the cables from Moscow that show that they warned us against that if you try to insert NATO right on our doorstep in Ukraine, this is what's going to happen. Civil war, and we'll have to decide, we Russians, as to whether we will intervene or not. They told us that. It's in the cables, okay? So on that point, that started the downturn in relations with Russia, and that was exacerbated just a few months later, on July 17th, 2014, when someone shot down MH17, the Malaysian airliner, killing, I think, 298 people. And that was blamed on the Russians, the pro-Russians, Russians. And no evidence has ever been adduced to show that it was the Russians. So there was that, and things just went downhill from there until, and this is interesting, until Putin and Obama met at the UN in 2015, and in New York. And Putin said, look, because your intelligence people have doubtless told you, that we have been shipping aircraft, AAA, anti-aircraft missiles, all manner of weaponry into Syria. I just want to let you know why. And the why is that we're not at all happy with your kind of weak offensive against the terrorists, the real terrorists there. We have some skin in the game here. I mean, there are about 5,000 Russians from Chechnya and elsewhere in Russia. They're going to come back to Russia, well-trained, well-equipped to do terrorism in our country. So I just want to let you know, Mr. President, that we're going to use that weaponry the day after tomorrow. We're going to start using our Air Force to go after these terrorists that you really haven't even touched, including all those trucks that carry the oil into into Turkey so the Turks can rearm, pay by rearming the terrorists. So that's what happened. And for the next year, Obama and Putin, his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, and John Kerry tried to work out a ceasefire. Now, they got a ceasefire. It took 11 months, but they got one. Okay. They got one, 9 months, I guess it took. They got one in September of 2016. And it was in effect for 5 days before the U.S. Air Force violated by hitting fixed Syrian army positions that had been there for months. Okay. End of the ceasefire. How do you explain that? Well, John Kerry has since given an interview to the Boston Globe saying, we worked this out, Putin and Obama approved it, but, not everybody in Washington agrees with these things. And he all but said the Department of Defense decided this wasn't a good idea, and so they struck these Russian sites. Putin, 2 months later, at one of these conferences that they have in Valdai in southern Russia, he says, I don't know how this happens, but the President of the United States and I agree on something like a ceasefire. And then when John Kerry gets back to Washington, I don't know who makes the real decisions here, but it's not the President of the United States. And I don't know how to deal with that, says Putin. Well, that's big. Okay. So what we have now is a very acid relationship with Russia. We may pretend to be still the superpower of the world, but we know that our efforts in Syria have gone without success. And now we're going back into Afghanistan, which is, a real fool's errand. Everyone who knows about that since Alexander the Great, for Pete's sake, did you know that Alexander the Great was one of the first ones that tried to go through Afghanistan to get the riches in China? I mean, it's a great story. He's a pretty bright guy, right? He's got all his field marshals and all, and they're taking hits from this incorrigible natives who don't like foreign people coming into their country. I mean, they just don't understand. He was the sole superpower in the world at the time, Alexander the Great, right? So his generals are taking such casualties on their flanks that he calls a council of war. And they say, what are we going to do here? I mean, is this worth it to get to China? And then they looked at those mountains between Afghanistan and China. And Alexander said, let's go back to Asia Minor. Well, we know what the heck we're doing, huh? Let's get out of here, That's why they call him great, He had the good sense to say, this is really stupid. Now, since then, we've had the Indians and the Persians and the British and the French and the United States. And what's happened? Well,
and now they want to privatize through the the guy Eric Prince and who used to be called Blackwater, and now it's called something else. Now they want to privatize the whole thing, which is kind of appalling. Ray, I just wanted to ask you something about back to the CIA because there's a bit of echo happening for some reason. I'm not sure. Do you still have those in? Oh, great. Hopefully it'll settle down. I was just wondering, the CIA is like 70 years old now, and I just wondered. You mentioned that there was this like a structural flaw in the way it was created, in that they brought in individuals that were sort of basically into overthrowing governments, and so the real reason it was created. I just wondered what you think about its original purpose, the CIA being created, and is there this underlying basic thing, which is to destroy and demonize anything that threatens U.S. interests, and in particular capitalism? And so I just wonder if you could talk about the CIA and and how its original purpose and now what it represents.
Sure. You need to go back to President Truman, who was aware of what happened in Pearl Harbor. Now, before the Japanese attack, there were all kinds of little snippets of information from the FBI, from the code breakers. We had broken some of the Japanese codes. From the Army Air Force, from the Navy, there were Japanese subs seen in Honolulu, and from public broadcasts in Tokyo showing that they were ratcheting up their acrimony. All kinds of. Where was the Japanese fleet? Hello? Well, now if there were one inbox, and for young people out there, you have to realize we used to have inboxes made out of wood, right? Okay. If into one inbox came all this information, and one person was responsible for putting it all together and say, hey, Mr. President, it looks like the Japanese are about to attack Hawaii, that would have happened. And so what Truman was hell-bent and determined to do was to make sure there would be one intelligence agency, okay, central, that's what it's all about, a central place where all this information, whether it's decoded messages or photography or public media, all come into one inbox, okay? That's what the central intelligence community. And the other thing that he wanted was to make it responsible to whom? To the Pentagon, which was saying that the Russians were 10 feet tall? I don't think so. To the State Department, was always defending its policy? I don't think so. He wanted to make it responsible directly to him. And that's what he did, okay? His idea was to have an outfit that could speak truth to power in those terms, that would speak without fear or favor, and would have, and I worked in that, okay, would have career protection for telling the president the truth. Now, if you were president, Tricia, wouldn't you want to have one place to go where you could depend on that, right? One place to go without an agenda, right? So that's what attracted me to the CIA. And I was able to function in that way for almost the entire 27 years that I stayed there as an analyst. Toward the end, it got a little raggedy when Bill Casey and Bobby Gates took over. So what happened? Well, the legislation was all prepared. We're talking 1947, right? Right after the war. It's all set to set up this analysis agency. Would it be secret? Well, there's some information that you have to collect through clandestine means, right? You have to run your own spies. So, oh yeah, it would have to be secret. I mean, because the collection would have to be kept secret, the spies protected. But that was the name of the game. Now, at the same time, back from the war came the swashbuckling heroes. This is not to take anything away from them. I mean, these guys and women were incredibly brave, imaginative, and they were real good about things like overthrowing governments and, incidentally, bringing Ho Chi Minh into Hanoi on their shoulders, literally, after he and his troops had sent the Japs packing, Japanese. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a bunch of people, thousands of them, coming back from the war, and they're saying, well, thanks a lot for the applause. And the applause, as I said, was well-deserved. But they're like, have any work for us? I mean, should we go back to academe or law firms or corporations? Should we hang around? Now, 1947, right? We have the Russians already overrunning Eastern Europe. We have the Russian secret police, the Soviet secret police, spread out around the world, causing mischief of all kinds, including overthrowing governments. So the idea was, and George Kennan, who we mentioned before, was the primary proponent of this. If the Russians are doing anything, we have to be able to do them too. Okay. So the question was, let's tell them to stay here in Washington. We got work for you to do. We may have a government or two to overthrow by and by. So what was the problem? The problem was it's kind of hard to set up a department for overthrowing governments or an agency for overthrowing government. Just in those days, at least, and we didn't have regime change. Maybe today we could have a agency for regime change. Okay, we do actually, but it just didn't sound right, right? So somebody got the really stupid idea to say, "Oh, look, we have this analysis group, and they're going to be secret because they'll be running spies to get information, to collect information. So, yeah, we'll put the overthrowers of government in with the analysts, and it'd just be one big happy family, and they'd be all the secret, right?" So that's what I refer to as the structural fault from the beginning. They were inserted there at the last minute and justified, and this is interesting, in the legislation, the president is given this power. It reads this way: the director of the CIA shall perform such other tasks and functions as the president shall from time to time direct. I'll say it again. Director of the CIA shall perform such other duties and functions as the president shall from time to time direct. Period. Whoa.
Yeah.
You know?
Can I ask you? I'm sorry.
No, so that's the juridical. Now, that doesn't mean that they should be able to violate the law and oversee. Of course, that's the name of the game. But they take liberties with the law here in these United States as well, as we've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, they interfered in my own country's electoral thing in 1975. Was it 75? Gough Whitlam. Apparently they messed. He ended up being dismissed, the prime minister, and apparently the CIA was involved in that. So John Pilger writes. Anyway, the journalist John Pilger.
John is right.
Yeah, and that's terrible because Gough Whitlam actually was a pretty much bordering on a socialist type prime minister, and he was just dismissed, and that was the end of that. And then it's been downhill ever since then, basically.
Do Australians know that?
I don't think so. No, I don't. I think a lot of, in fact, I didn't know that, and I've been looking into this sort of thing. I didn't know that until probably last year, and I actually felt quite angry about it because he was going to be very, very significant, and he was great with Indigenous rights. He was basically it was going to be like free healthcare, and it was like that. It's been the free healthcare and all of that has been going along, and it's been gradually eaten away, white hand away. Over time, neoliberalism basically has taken hold here, and it's like a cancer. And so, it's been downhill ever since that time.
So that was a tragedy, okay? And we had our own tragedy when John Kennedy was killed. It's a very similar situation, and one can easily reason that the same kinds of people were involved. The teaching point here, I'm an old professor here, is that most Australians don't know that, and most Americans don't know what really happened to John Kennedy, and it's all because of this problem with the major media that I tried to emphasize before, the biggest change in the political landscape that I have witnessed in my many years.
Yes, because you mentioned that John F. Kennedy, you've mentioned that book, JFK, John F. Kennedy, The Unspeakable, and you said that that's a really good book for people to read. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of what happened to JFK, but I mean, he said he was going to basically, tear apart the CIA, basically get rid of them, and then a few months later he was dead. You can put that together fairly easily, I think, in a way. And of course, I think the CIA was involved with the Martin Luther King assassination in some way, weren't they?
Well,
anyway.
Army intelligence, it is proven that the government did away with Martin Luther King Jr. Nobody knows that because no press came to the trial, the civil trial.
Yeah,
when his family proved it that he was.
That was the end of the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Coretta King. Yeah, isn't that amazing? It's just amazing. I mean, it's so sewn up. The corporate media over there is so sewn up, and it's like that here too in Australia. The corporate, I mean, people are so dumbed down over here. Not only that, but there is no discussion whatsoever about any anti-war. There's hardly any anti-war movement to speak of. The Australian government just follows along, submits to any sort of requests that the US empire has of it. And so we just trundle along in all these, and of course at the present time, there's a very right-wing government here. You know, they're both much the same, just like in the United States, the DNC, you know, the Democratic Party and the, you know, GOP, they're pretty much this very thin sliver of light between them, and the same here in some ways. But, you know, we just follow along with any imperialist aims, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how immoral. And I mean, it's all immoral, messing with other people's governments in their countries, killing, like in Iraq, you know, over 1 million Iraqis, for resources and, you know, hegemony in the region. And in Afghanistan, you know, the opium fields, you know, that's increased incredibly. And I wonder actually how much of that money, you know, how drugs tend to be the way that the CIA funds itself. I wonder how much of that is, you know, going to what, heaven knows what. Cocaine is increased incredibly in, you know, Colombia, the crops, and I don't know. But anyway, I'm getting off the point here. But, you know, I just, I wondered if you sort of think how key is the CIA existence to U.S. imperialism? Can the government actually, you know, imperialize the way it is without the CIA's existence at this point?
Well, it would need something like the CIA, you know, and for most of the history that I'm aware of, the CIA was a tool in the hands of the president. Okay, I mentioned the rationale, you know, he shall perform such other functions and duties as the president shall from time to time direct. Well, sort of like the Marines. I mean, we had Smedley Butler, the general who said the war is a racket. I was a high-priced racketeer, putting down people in the Caribbean and Central America, and so if you have this imperial outlook at things, and if you want to economically dominate the world, you're going to need an instrument like this, whether they call it the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency or whatever. They don't call it overthrowing governments, but that's part of the woodwork, as we explained, or regime change. So it's this sinister thing where, as Vladimir Putin said in that op-ed in the New York Times, you know, if you consider yourself indispensable, then you arrogate to yourself certain rights that are at odds with what we know as the international principles of law, which really have been in effect since the Treaty of Westphalia, you know, the 17th century, for God's sake, when the Europeans finally said, hey, you know, instead of killing each other off, there might be a better idea here. Let's have borders between our countries, and let's have kind of laws that, you know, make it frowned upon to cross the border. That was 17th century. So we've sort of degraded, and I don't know how it is in your country, but when we marked the 800th anniversary of the famous agreement where King John was forced to acquiesce in the Magna Carta, that was 800 years ago, 15, a couple of years ago. I suggested we ought to have a funeral. You know, I mean, we ought to have an inquest, or maybe we ought to bury the Magna Carta, because one of the cardinal provisions, habeas corpus, my God, the right to find out where you are and why you're there, and all that. Habeas corpus, done away with in our country.
Yes, the Patriot Act is basically, you know, basically now the government can assassinate citizens, and that's okay. They can hold them without trial and without counsel, and that's okay. And that's just kind of slipped under the carpet. Like, I don't know if many Americans realize that, that they can be assassinated legally in their country now. I mean, they've already assassinated, I think, 4 U.S. citizens, including Anwar al-Awlaki, and it's actually legal in the the NDAA.
Yeah. It's like, the National Defense Authorization Act, where the Army could come in here and say, all right, McGovern, you're talking to the Australian person, go to Guantanamo. We got a place for you there. I mean,
yes,
that's possible.
I know. I know. I mean, and this is the sort of, and yet this sort of propaganda which is put out all over the world. And Australia still thinks that the US is, the land of the free and the, you know what I mean? They still think of that it's the bastion of all that is good. And yet at this present time, there's 8 different wars and backing the Saudis in their genocide of the Yemeni civilians, which is an appalling. It's happening right now. 1 child every 10 minutes is dying of famine and disease, and it's all U.S. backing of the Saudi monarchy. Basically committing a genocide in Yemen. All these things are going on, and yet, I don't know, people just are sitting on their hands and watch. I don't even know, 1, if a lot of people even know it's happening, but 2, if they do, what on earth, well, why are people not, sort of saying something? I mean, you said this very interesting thing in one of your interviews where you were talking to a group and somebody said to you, but 3 or 4 troops each week is a little price to pay for oil. And, and you sort of thought, oh my, goodness. And this was sort of in, I don't know, Virginia or something. It was up north. And there were, do you want to sort of speak a little bit about that and how you felt about that?
Yeah, this was about 12, 13 years ago. And I was giving a talk, and then we had assembled in the back. A lot of people are still interested in chatting. And this well-heeled young man, all dressed up to, really nice. And he says, he's about 35, I guess. He says, now, Mr. McGovern, you have to recognize that, 3 or 4 or 5 GIs, soldiers killed every week is a very small price to pay for the oil that we need. Now, I looked around at that group. It was in a pretty well-heeled suburb of Milwaukee, I think it was. Yeah, it was. And I expected to see, kind of, my God, did he just... But that was always it. What's McGovern going to say to this? And it was just such a
jaw-dropping
moment for me. Yeah. And I said, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. And he just did an about face and marched off to his, his Mercedes-Benz SUV.
Yes, because it's not his son. It's not his son that's being one of those 4.
That's exactly right. But I'm going to invoke the Noah principle now, if you allow me. The Noah principle, as you may know, is no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. Now, we know how bad it is. And I applaud you, Tricia. I really applaud you for doing what you're doing. I applaud everybody, including Amy Goodman and others who most of the time speak truth to power and let people know what's going on. But, Australians are courageous people at heart. I think we have to sort of give them a good boot in the rear end. I don't know exactly how to do that, but, I've been wrestling with this, and my insight, to the degree it's an insight, is, as somebody once said, the fault is not in our stars, it's in ourselves. Are we not imaginative enough? Are we not courageous enough to break through the Murdochs and the others and get out and reach the decent people in your country, as in mine, and say, look, this is just plain wrong. Not only are your children going to be subjected to this kind of thing, not only, well, I have a beef here. We have 9 grandchildren, okay? when the last was born 4 years ago,
Mm.
I said to myself, wow, when little Nora is as old as our youngest daughter, she's going to have a terrible decision to make, and that is it an ethical thing for me to bring new life into this world?
Yeah.
Because we're already having trouble breathing. We're already having
Yes.
trouble getting clean water. Can I bring a baby into this world? What a terrible, terrible thing. And so, you know, what more do we need to give ourselves a good kick in the pants and say, all right, get out there, get arrested if you need to, but show people, especially young people, that this is really, really dangerous. And as I say, start building arcs rather than simply predicting more rain.
That's true. And, you know, the Trump has just recently given the police even more power, like literally going to be able to get access to all the military weapons and stuff. This is a sort of a recent thing. And, you know, you talk about putting bodies on the line and stuff. What do you feel about that, you know, with this increase in basically the police are just going to be like the military, really, in a way. And I think you sort of felt like that in the US it's marching towards actual martial law and that sort of thing. Is that correct, Ray?
It's very disquieting because the new law, the National Defense Authorization Act that you mentioned, reverses a century and a half of tradition whereby the U.S. Army, the armed forces, are prohibited by law from being used in a law enforcement domestic concept. You know, that was the law. It was called posse comitatus. Okay. Now the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act of I think 2012, if I have that right,
2012,
reversed that. Okay, and said no. Now the president can use these troops in any way he needs to preserve order in the country. And also to wrap up people who are suspected of giving support, material support to terrorism. So now how's that going to work out? Well, I don't know. Smart people tell me that the poverty draft that obtains in our country, where people talk about a volunteer army, but it's not a volunteer army, it's a poverty draft. More than half of the people who serve are from the inner city or towns in our country of less than 50,000 people. These are people who are deprived of the advantages that most of us have for an education, for a good job, and so they gravitate toward the army. Now, I don't know if they would have the gumption, as so many did in Vietnam, to disobey orders, to say, no, I'm not going to lock up these people. They look just like me. These are people who are just trying to get their rights or not. But that's the big unresolved question. What is clear is that what Obama, when he saw the Occupy movement, do you remember the Occupy movement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That was perceived as a big, big threat. It was put down mercilessly, okay? But they were planning for the future. Like I could see the congressman saying, suppose instead of 5,000, suppose there were 50,000. And suppose they surrounded the Capitol building or our offices and we couldn't get home for our martinis in Georgetown. Oh, what could we do? Well, we could call the National Park Service police. Oh no, they've shown far too much sympathy for these riffraff. Oh, well, we got the Secret Service. Nah, there aren't enough of the Secret Service. Oh, we've got the Capitol Police. No, the Capitol Police, they're good at using those machines so you can't bring a weapon. But we got the DC Police. No, the DC Police, 90% of them look like the demonstrators. What we can do? And then somebody says, well, it looks like we have to go to the army. I think that was the genesis of all that. They were scared. And they wanted to be able to call in the army. So whether the Army is going to comply with orders to shoot us or to wrap us all up and put us in jails, I don't know. But that's the big unanswered question. And the key seems to me to be people like you and others that can get through to these young people and say, look, this is the way it really is. It's a mercenary situation where imperialism is involved, and our indispensability is playing out in a way that is redounding to the detriment of the people who need a fair shake in our country don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like you say, the poor draft, you know, that's really true. And I sometimes I think, you know, the rot in the, you know, the US and the way it deals with its citizens, like way back, you know, when the World War One veterans were looking for the money that they were owed, and then
Bonus.
And then everybody, the government just sort of sent in, I don't know, troops or police, and basically started shooting people to get them out of the park. I mean, you know, all these signs, I mean, of course, right from, you know, the inception of, you know, the US, you know, the way indigenous people were just wiped out. And then there was the Constitution was sort of created by slave-owning oligarchs, basically, in a way. Do you know what I mean? You know, it hasn't been a great beginning. But I mean, I think about that time, you know, with the World War One, the way you know, there's always this great, support the troops, and you know, we love our troops because, of course, they're helping empire expand. But I mean, it's always we love our troops until they come back and they're injured and maimed and everything, and then it's like you're on your own, you know. And it's sad because, you know, unfortunately, people keep joining the military because the social inequality, it's just getting more, and the disparity, you know, between the haves and the have everything's is, you know, so great now, and so that sort of keeps feeding. I don't know. It just, I sort of sometimes wonder, you know, where it's going to end. But I just sort of wondered if we could just, I know this is sort of digressing away from something, but I just wanted to ask you about back in 9/11 and there was Minerva. You had an 8-minute private conversation with Minerva about Cheney and the plane basically that was heading toward the Pentagon, I think. And if you could just share that. I'm sorry, Mineta, was it? I'm sorry. Yeah. I know that's a big kind of a step away from what we were talking about, but I just found this interesting, and I just thought you might like to share that.
Well, one of the advantages, or at least it could be looked upon that way, of living in Washington is you get to go to these things and you get to see high muckety mucks, as my Irish grandmother would have called them, right? Okay.
Muckety mucks.
Muckety mucks, yeah. And so here I was invited to read part of the Constitution on Constitution Day back in 2006 or 7 or something like that. And I noticed that Mineta, who had been Secretary of Transportation during 9/11, that he was going to be reading a couple of amendments after me. And I did a little reconnaissance, and I saw how people were being let out if they wanted to leave at that point. And so I stationed myself in this little, well, grandiose little corridor there at Georgetown University and waited for him to come out. And he came out. And you have to know the culture in Washington. No one can possibly forget somebody who might be important, right? So here I was dolled up. I had a tie on, all that stuff. I looked like I could possibly be important. So I said, Secretary Mineta, Ray McGovern. And he looked for a second. Oh yeah, Ray, sure. You know, so we shake hands. And then I said, Secretary Mineta, do you have a second? He said, sure. I said, well, you know, I'm intrigued by you being in the bunker with Dick Cheney and that fellow that kept coming in and said, 10 minutes out or 5 minutes out. And what do you think that was all about? He says, I don't know. I said, well, who was, did you ever figure out who that guy was that kept saying Cheney now? Are you going to change your orders? I said, no. I said, well, did he have a uniform on? No, he didn't have a uniform on. I said, but you never checked to see who he was? No, I didn't. I said, so I said, well, you know, that was just before the plane hit the Pentagon. So don't you think that maybe there was at least a temporal relationship there, perhaps even a causal one? And he said, well, you know, that plane that went down in Pennsylvania, you know, that one went. I said, no, Secretary Manette, I'm talking about Pentagon, not the Pennsylvania. But, you know, Pennsylvania. Well, he had this kind of thought process that kicked in. Whenever you're confronted with what happened in that bunker with Cheney, say Pennsylvania. I said, Pennsylvania. It was really ludicrous. He went on for about 2 whole minutes about Pennsylvania. I said, no, Secretary, time out, Secretary. I'm talking about the Pentagon. He said, well, I have to go now. Yeah. What's that all about? You know, what's that all about?
Really?
And so a little interesting aspect here. 3 weeks later, I had to speak in California. So I landed in this plane in San Jose, California. And the name of the international airport is Norman Mineta International Airport.
Yeah, right.
So if you play the game right, you could get an airport named after you.
Really?
Well, it happened with Norman Mineta. So I don't frankly know what to make of that, but it smelled to high heaven. And he seemed to
really
like speaking from Roche, like, don't go near there. Dick Cheney is still alive. You know, funny thing, you know, we need to keep our sense of humor in all this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
really?
when Dick Cheney kept getting really sick and going to the hospital, I have a woman friend who was really, really very devout Christian, and she came up to me at one point and she said, you know, Ray, when Dick Cheney goes into the hospital with these serious heart ailments, I pray so hard, but I don't think the good Lord here's my prayers. I said, why do you say that? And she said, well, because he always gets better.
Oh, Jesus. Whoops. Hey, Ray, I'm going to jump a bit all over the place here because there's some little sort of things I wanted to ask you that they probably seem a bit unrelated. So please excuse me if it doesn't flow very well. But I just wanted to ask you about, you know, because the NSA basically receives and you know, it basically has all the emails that just particularly in the United States. And so it has all and before I suppose Congress even realized that, it had all their, you know, correspondence and all of that. So highly blackmailable material the NSA has.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So with that, you know, there's sort of basically I suppose if anybody steps out of line, somebody who's associated with the NSA can just say, well, do you remember that phone call you had with that particular woman, yada, 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 or that, you know, deal that you did with such, and basically can always corral them to do what they want to do. I mean, with the NSA still functioning like that, it can't possibly, not that I'm saying that Congress is, most people in Congress aren't, I mean, they basically, like you talk about the blood-soaked, you know, they basically doing whatever the arms industry want them to do in some ways, really, aren't they? A lot of them, they should be wearing logos of the different, like Raytheon and on their shirts and stuff. But, you know, the NSA, it has highly blackmailable material, like how all those people are, you know, they're like little puppets really in a way, aren't they? Anybody could just step in and say, excuse me, we have this on you. Don't go that way. Is that sort of...
You're quite right. And this is J. Edgar Hoover on steroids, okay? Because J. Edgar Hoover used to do wiretaps. Now we have...
Right.
Don't need a wire anymore. It's wireless, right?
No.
And I'll give you an example, which really, I think, speaks to this problem. 10 years ago, after George Bush and Dick Cheney started what Nuremberg called a war of aggression, okay? Out and out, simple war of an aggression. The Democrats took over the House of Representatives. The year was 2006. 2007, so exactly 10 years ago, Cindy Sheehan and I we had an interview with John Conyers, who was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, which, of course, is the committee that needs to start impeachment proceedings. Okay, so we're saying, my God, finally, thank you. We've got a majority in the House. If starting a war of aggression, torturing people, kidnapping, and illegal eavesdropping, if that's not enough to impeach somebody, something wrong with this, okay? Somebody doesn't understand what our founders had in mind when they put a very orderly process into our Constitution, which allowed people to deal with this in a very considered political manner. High crimes and misdemeanors, you impeach. Okay, so we went to John Conyers, Cindy Sheehan and I, and there were about 3 of his lawyers in the background. And he said, so what are you doing? And so we said, well, we're here to make sure that you're going to start impeachment proceedings. And he said, oh, no, I can't do that. And we looked at him and he said, well, you're the chair of the Judiciary Committee. You actually were on the Judiciary Committee when the impeachment articles were voted for Richard Nixon. Why can't you do that? Oh, no, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, she says no. So you can't do that because your Democratic leadership says no. Well, why do they say no? Well, she says that if we impeach George Bush and Dick Cheney, we'll appear divisive, and then we won't win as many votes in the next election. And I'm thinking, my God, our founders turning over their grave, for crass political reasons. You can't impeach because then you won't win as big in 2008. And so I said, but, it's your duty to impeach under the Constitution. He looks at me, he says, okay, Mr. Head Spy. He says, there's nothing in the Constitution that says John Conyers has to impeach the president. Now, get out of here. I refuse to leave. It's the only time, many times I've been arrested, that I was convicted, convicted of illegal assembly, because I couldn't, in good conscience, leave that office simply having been told we can't impeach. Now, what's the point of my story? Okay, the point of my story is I'm telling all this to the former technical director of the National Security Agency, the NSA. His name is Bill Binney. And he says, Ray, you're missing something. I said, oh, what's that, Bill? He says, Nancy Pelosi can't go against these guys. These guys have the book on Nancy Pelosi. They can say, we briefed Nancy Pelosi on the torture, and she said, no problem. We briefed her on the illegal surveillance, which we did, says Bill Binney. And she said, no problem. And so it's not just political crassness or whatever the noun is. It's not only being politically crass, it's a matter of blackmail, pure and simple. They have this kind of data on everybody. And so for Nancy Pelosi to step out of line and say, yeah, we're going to impeach the president, well, you're going to have to pay the price from the CIA guys who have these memos of conversation, right? They said, well, you should know, American people, that Representative Pelosi was briefed on June 19th, and she approved the torture and the eavesdropping and waterboarding and the whole 9 yards. So I offer that as a kind of a case study in the Harvard Business School tradition of how it works. And, I fancy myself as a pretty astute observer, but that never even occurred to me. But Bill Binney, of course, working at the NSA, knew that they have that capability, that they were exercising it at that time. And so it's not just the CIA, it's the NSA and the FBI. And they tried the same thing on Trump. Do you remember? Even before he took the presidency, they showed him this dossier that some British people had, this terrible stuff that he was said to be guilty of having done in a Moscow hotel and that stuff. It was James Comey, the head of the FBI, who stayed behind to show the president-elect what they had on him. So, sinister? Yeah. Sinister. If I were Trump, would I resent that? I sure as heck would.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure they. I mean, I saw there was a joke that when each president goes in, do they just show them the Zapruder film and sort of say, well, this is what happens if you try and mess with the CIA, and then they just show them the whole brief of the what they've got on them and say, okay, well, no, just follow along. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that they don't already have those types of but it wouldn't it be wonderful if one of them just said, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to resign, like in public, say, I obviously, if they were any good in the first place, I obviously can't do what I would like to do. I'm going to resign, and just say, and then say why they're going to resign. But they all just go along, with it. It's,
they're creatures of the system to begin with. And
yes,
Obama was the archetypical subservient fellow to John Brennan. And I can prove that in so many ways. And John Brennan hacked into the Senate computers. And when John Brennan resisted the publication of the Senate report on torture, Obama was with him 110%. It was only because of some gutsy senators that executive summary ever got out. So there's lots of evidence that Obama became very, very aware very early on that his freedom of maneuver was very circumscribed, and that he could be president and for 8 years, just as long as he didn't cross the military-industrial intelligence complex.
Yeah. And I was mentioning to you earlier about Tulsi Gabbard introducing that bill into Congress to stop the illegal funding of terrorists. And I mean, the fact that somebody can actually, that bill actually needs to be introduced into Congress to stop the illegal funding of terrorists. I mean, if it weren't so sad, it would be really funny. And it just sort of, and like Hillary Clinton, through the Podesta emails, we find out that she knew that Saudi Arabia funds terrorists, and she was receiving big donations from them, and all this. It's all sort of out in plain sight, and it's like, what happens? Like there's no reporting of it. The fact that somebody even has to say that, I mean, they're doing it anyway. The U.S. is funding, these terrorists that they call moderate rebels that are basically pillaging and raping and destroying each one country after another. It's a great little band of like mafia that are going through and helping, achieve hegemony in the region. But I just find that amazing that somebody has introduced a bill and it hasn't made any ripple in the mainstream media, and that you know what I mean? It's just,
well, I do know what you mean, yeah. And what I would stress here is that when Ronald Reagan decided to make a war on the government in Nicaragua and use the Contras to do this, it became so apparent what was going on. Salvador, Nicaragua, some of the leading Congress people went down there and found out that they were murdering nuns and priests and anyone who was struggling for justice. And they came back and they passed legislation forbidding the supply of money and arms to these disreputable folks. Now, that was the genesis of the whole Iran-Contra stuff, because Bill Casey, head of the CIA, decided, well, we have to fund these guys some way. And so they, long story, they got the Israelis to give some tanks to the Iranians, they got some money back, and they gave them to the Contras. So there's precedent there. In other words, Congress can do this. The fact that Tulsi Gabbard has got no support at all speaks volumes about the present coloration of Congress. So you're right to focus on that. Tulsi Gabbard is one strong, very, very good congressperson. I just wish they were more like her.
Yeah, although I've seen that she's been sort of like supporting some of the imperialist aims, though I've noticed that, she can do that on one hand and yet sort of is totally fine with some, some other things that are happening. I don't know. But anyway, I wanted to ask you also about, how with the electronic voting machines, they're hackable. And, I mean, here in Australia, we have paper ballots, and, you can really, really tell. Also with the exit polls, you can tell what's happening with elections. But in the United States, it's like, you know, every election it seems to be that there's this lots and lots of discrepancies, and then, you know, then the electoral infrastructure has been handed over to Homeland Security, which, so, you know, it's basically, and of course the DNC has openly sort of showed everybody they don't care who wins the primary. They have selected their candidate, and, you know, they do it in the back room smoking cigars, they say. So basically 2020 probably might be Kamala Harris and I don't know, there's a question of Gillibrand, somebody. And I'm just thinking, you know, with all of this going on, and also the fact that there isn't any preferential voting, there's no sort of, you know, ranked choice voting or anything, and also the fact that Jill Stein recently, they did this lawsuit where they were trying to get, you know, into the debates, and the judge has just thrown that out. So, you know, you can't even get any other voices in a debate, and you've got all this electronic voting machine hacking that, you know, that they don't even allow those machines in Europe. You know, and then you've got the corporate media basically refusing to show anybody else. So it's, you know, I think it was proven that it's actually an oligarchy in the United States. It's not really a democracy. But how on earth is there ever going to be any other voices, you know what I mean? Like, where is this leading? You know, like, it's just going to be this duopoly, which is just a war duopoly. How is this ever going to change with all those problems?
Well, there's been a lot of rain falling, and we're going to build some arks. We're going to get out in the street. We're going to demonstrate within our rights, and we're going to be winter soldiers like our first founders were. You know, they were up against the British, pretty substantial force. It's going to take that, and I don't know what the outcome will be, but I do know that we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's too far gone. It's too precious a thing to have a country that started out in some ways on the right path. Habeas corpus, all kinds of things need to be resuscitated. And of course, I'm not an expert on domestic affairs. All I know is that we're going to hell in a handbasket. But I also know that we have to stop predicting rain, and we need to build some arks. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you now because I have to get...
Yes. Thanks, Ray. I was going to say I've kept you longer than what I said I would, and I really appreciate it. That you're taking the time. I know you've got to travel tomorrow, so thank you so much. And if you at all feel like, you know, if you ever have any time in the future to return and talk about some other issues, that would be great.
Be happy to do that. Meanwhile, people can see me on or can read me or see my film clips and so forth on raymcgovern.com. And if I don't mention that, then my webmaster, who happens to be my youngest son, gets very angry. raymcgovern.com.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. It was a pleasure, and I really appreciate it. And thanks so much, everybody, for watching. And next week, I'll let you go, Ray, so I'll just exit the screen so you can go. Thanks so much, Ray.
You're most welcome.
Okay, thank you. So next week, friends, we'll have Dr. Dahlia Wasfree. Actually, before that, we have John Preisner again on Wednesday. Wednesday at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. John and I are going to have another go at, you're welcome, Lauren. We're going to have another go at talking about DPRK and his recent trip there. We tried last Wednesday, and unfortunately there was a lot of, John has a bit of a poor internet connection at the time, so he's going to try at a different location. So next Wednesday, we're going to have another go, and that's at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And after that, we have Dr. Dahlia Wasfree, who's very, very interesting, and that's on Friday, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So thank you so much for watching, and that was very interesting. I had a lot of other questions I wanted to ask Ray, but he actually was already, I didn't realize we were already half an hour over time. So so thank you so much for watching. This is my name's Trish Robertson. You're watching The Naked Empire. Till next Wednesday. Bye for now.